Good afternoon or good morning, depending on where you're tuning in from. We are going to get started with today's webinar on the subject of e-Stewards version 4.1. So we're providing a high-level overview of the changes between version 4.0 and 4.1, and covering some of the transition requirements in today's webinar. So we are making assumptions here that the majority of the attendees are either currently certified to e-Stewards version 4.0 or at least are somewhat familiar with the e-Stewards standard. It's not an overview of the standard as a whole. We're going to focus on the key changes and what the transition audits entail. My name is Austin Matthews. I'm the EHS Program Manager with PJR. Welcome. I have a brief agenda on the first slide here. We'll talk a little bit about PJR, who we are, what we do to get started, cover at a high level some of the benefits of certification to a standard like e-Stewards. We'll cover those transition details as promised and then spend the bulk of the time on the key changes themselves. We'll close with any questions that you might have. Feel free to type those questions into the chat field at any point throughout the presentation, but I will save those for the end. And just to get some of these questions out of the way, today's presentation is being recorded, and a recording of the presentation as well as a copy of the slides will be uploaded to PGR's website for you to access at a later time. Perry Johnson Registrars is one of the leading registrars in the world. We have certified clients to a wide variety of standards around the world. And while this list of countries in which we've certified clients isn't necessarily all-inclusive, it certainly gives you an idea of our global presence as a certification body. I mentioned a variety of standards. Obviously today we are talking about e-Stewards, but Perry Johnson Registrars is accredited to grant certifications to our clients for a wide variety of standards depending on the industry you're in. Some of these may look familiar to you as well. Some of the benefits of certification to a standard like e-Stewards include what the standard really represents, being able to advertise that certification relays that your organization shares those core values or makes those commitments a priority. So e-Stewards represents a commitment to prevent irresponsible or illegal handling of hazardous waste or electronic waste streams. It also represents data security and protection expectations, social responsibility, and environmental protection as well. Maintaining the standard can reduce environmental, occupational health, and safety risks for the organization, as well as reducing data security and social accountability risks. So the e-Steward standard, unlike some of the other standards we saw on the previous slide, cover environmental, health and safety, data security, and social accountability risks and concepts within it. It is a pretty broad scope for an electronic waste standard. Other business management drivers for certification might include improvements to public image. Again, the ability to advertise the certification and what it stands for, relaying that that's something that's important to your organization, and that can lead to improvements in public image. Advertising of the ability to responsibly manage electronics and electronic components can go a long way. It can also provide a competitive advantage if you're bidding for contracts or work and your competitors do not maintain certification to e-Stewards. This can give you a leg up. The standard itself also includes or represents a framework for maintaining compliance with applicable requirements. This could be customer requirements, it could be regulatory requirements, it could be both. It often is both. The Basel Convention is one important example of relevant regulatory requirements to which e-Stewards clients are subject. And this governs the legality of import and export of e-waste and hazardous substances to specific countries. Version 4.0 was, version 4.1 was published this past February, and you can access a copy of the standard with the changes highlighted through the links here right on e-Stewards website. You can also access the sanctioned interpretations, which we'll touch on later. Those were released as part of the transition expectations as well. There's A and B parts to the sanctioned interpretations. You can also access the transition plan on the e-Stewards website that was published a little bit later, around mid-March. The transition plan dictated specific deadlines for clients who were already certified to e-Stewards version 4.0. There was a grace period between the publication of the standard and the transition plan for clients to still have an audit to version 4.0. So they had a little bit of time to prepare and implement some of the requirements, depending on when their annual audit deadline fell. We are past that deadline now. So the April 22nd deadline has passed. All e-Stewards audits are now required to be to version 4.1. The expectations within the transition plan also go on to require that existing e-Stewards clients implement the sanctioned interpretations. I mentioned there's parts A and B. And in terms of showing progress, to be able to demonstrate that the organization has identified measures to implement those changes. So if some of the changes were going to take a little bit longer, you could at least have plans for how they'll be implemented if it's not something that could have been implemented before your initial version 4.1 audit or by that April 22nd date. As I mentioned now, all audits are being conducted to version 4.1 according to the transition plan. The transition plan allows transition audits to go on-site or virtually if the client's a good candidate for virtual auditing techniques, so this doesn't impact the virtual eligibility of a client. And transition audits are also permitted for e-Stewards version 4.1 to occur during surveillance or recertification audits based on where in the cycle the transition audit is falling and the client's own preference. PJR does reserve the right to add time to a surveillance audit that is being conducted as a transition to version 4.1 to ensure that all of the changes and all of the transition criteria can be covered in the time allotted to the audit. The overall deadline to transition to e-Stewards version 4.1 communicated in the transition plan is April 22nd, 2023. So a total of a year, not a ton of time, depending on when your audit falls. Any outstanding version 4.0 certificates will be withdrawn and invalidated on April 22nd. So if your audit falls in the beginning of Q2 for 2023 and you haven't transitioned yet, PJR has relayed a recommendation to have your transition audit be conducted no later than February 1st of next year to prevent a lapse in certification. And that would also be the case if your audit is tentatively scheduled or planned to fall in the second half of Q1 2023. What we mean by this recommendation or this deadline is all of the post-audit activities that take place before a certificate can be issued. We want to allow time for all of those things to take place without having a lapse in certification for that April 22nd deadline. Some examples might include needing time to close any nonconformities that result from your transition audit, the time it will take the technical package reviewer to review the audit package, the approval of a sample certificate by the certificate department and by the client themselves, paying any outstanding balances. All of those items could hold up the certificate issuance, and without allowing adequate time for that, a lapse is likely. So we do recommend an audit takes place by February 1st if you haven't transitioned by then. Shifting gears to focus on some of the key changes in version 4.1. Again, we are assuming some understanding of the e-Stewards standard or a current certification to e-Stewards version 4.0 here. We're just going to cover some of the key differences between the two. Version 4.1 accepts RIOS certification instead of ISO 14001. Previously, ISO 14001 certification was the only acceptable prerequisite standard. Now you can choose between ISO 14001 and RIOS. The e-Stewards processor definition has been revised, and this clarifies that control, and that's capitalized because that's a defined term as well, extends even to electronic equipment not subjected to processing. So a processor could obtain control of electronic equipment without necessarily being the ones to process them themselves, and it could still be relevant to the scope, the e-Stewards standard, and all of the expectations within it. Problematic components or materials, also known as PCMs, that definition has also been revised. PVC is specifically removed from this revised definition because it is an HEW. There's a lot of acronyms in e-Stewards. So since it's an HEW and it's already listed in Y48 of the Basel Convention Annex, Annex number 2 specifically, this was redundant. So PVCs were removed from the definition of PCMs. Processing facility is a new term in version 4.1, or perhaps it's a revised definition. I don't recall off the top of my head, but it now includes the concept of a processing facility, now includes mobile processing. It addresses sampling, it addresses applicability in the cases of multi-sites, and it also touches on the impact of the e-Stewards requirements to achieve certification if we are looking at a multi-site specifically, since as we know, e-Stewards requires all of the locations within a certain geographical area to be certified together or within a certain period of time so that all of the locations within that area, perhaps it's by country, are all certified. There is clarification to the requirements regarding transboundary movements in 6.1.3.1. So this was to reword and clarify the requirements regarding, again, transboundary movements. e-Stewards isn't able to dictate the governmental criteria. We can't, the e-Stewards standard can't insist on prior informed consent in regions that don't require it or don't consider waste to be hazardous. So this is deferring to the governmental criteria or regulatory requirements regarding transboundary movements of waste. e-Stewards isn't identifying something as hazardous if the local government or the country's own government does not identify it as hazardous. So that clarification can be found in 6.1.3.1 in version 4.1. The performance verification program section of the standard, which is 6.1.4, was also revised and expanded. So that's not a new requirement. The performance verification program, e-Stewards certified organizations will already have that PV program in place. However, they'll need to check out these revised requirements and adjust their program and their processes accordingly to ensure that they've accounted for any additional requirements that have been added. 8.5.1b was also revised, and this is specifically regarding the language used to cover rechargeable batteries for direct reuse. So the language is touching on the documentation expectations, and this goes hand in hand with a revised definition of repurposing that can be found in version 4.1. So with the tweaks to the repurposing definition, there's the possibility that rechargeable batteries could be sent for direct reuse. So they had to tweak the language so that one requirement didn't contradict another, so that they were in agreement, the 8.5.1b section and the repurposing definition and section that we'll talk about in just a moment. So, as I mentioned, there is the concept of direct reuse for batteries, and this is found in 8.5.1b3. This is a new section. This touches on the possibility that batteries could have a direct reuse market without testing, but it is really specific. So these would be in specific instances where it can't be tested without presenting a significant risk to the personnel who would be doing the testing, and really specific or prescriptive criteria need to be met in conjunction with utilizing this opportunity or section requirement. There's also a new section on repurposing, and this again is in alignment with the revised definition to clarify when repurposing can constitute an acceptable form of direct reuse. This is not only touching on the concept of functionality, but also the transparency expectations that e-Stewards has. Continuing on with some of the key changes, we have section 8.5.2 that covers QSCs. This has been clarified to cover IDPs conducting the testing. There's also clarification in 8.6.1a regarding the evidence of conditionally allowable options, what specifically constitutes approval on the part of the e-Stewards administrator. So if you are an organization certified to e-Stewards that utilizes a conditionally allowable option or plans to, definitely take a look at the changes in 8.6.1a to make sure you have what constitutes approval and what's going to hold water when you are audited to the standard. There are also revisions in version 4.1 to the criteria regarding non-e-Steward downstream processors. So this would be in sections 8.8.2.1 and 8.8.2.3. So there are necessary criteria identified to be able to process and or dispose the e-Steward organization's materials of concern. And this revision also removes the requirement for all downstream processors in the recycling chain to have closure plans. This would now just be relevant for immediate downstream processors or IDPs. There is additional verbiage in Section 8.9 regarding the data security expectations, the NAID AAA certification transitions, etc. So take a look at 8.9. Specifically, some of those changes are meant to clarify the requirement for e-Stewards organizations to protect personal data, even if the upstream claims it has been sanitized already. So unless a customer retains ownership throughout the process, the expectations for data security still fall on the e-Stewards organization as part of their certification to the standard requirements. I mentioned sanctioned interpretations A and B being relevant to the transition as well. So sanctioned interpretation A focuses primarily on the changes in the main body of the standard, the main text, including the definitions, doesn't cover the appendices as much, except where those changes may overlap. On the other hand, sanctioned interpretation B focuses primarily, not exclusively, on the changes within the appendices. In sanctioned interpretation B, the most prominent change, repeated several times, are all the places that the appendices or the standard required ISO 14001 in version 4.0 to now allow clients to decide whether they want ISO 14001 or RIOS. For anyone who is pursuing certification for the first time and is attending, this webinar to learn a bit more about the standard and prepare for upcoming registration audits, I do have a summary of the registration audit process, just as a quick overview. Some of the first steps in pursuing initial registration or certification for the first time include obtaining a copy of the standard itself, establishing documentation that meets the requirements. Everywhere we see SMS, we mean Stewardship Management System. As I mentioned earlier, the e-Stewards standard includes environmental, occupational health, safety, data security, and social accountability. So that's referred to as the Stewardship Management System. It wouldn't be totally accurate to call it an environmental health and safety management system or an EHS management system. So we call that SMS, Stewardship Management System. And in addition to the documentation, you'll need to conduct training. You'll need to implement the various requirements and controls. You'll need an internal audit, a compliance evaluation, a full system management review, and that should take place after the internal audit is conducted so that the results of the internal audit can serve as inputs to the management review. You'll need a contract with a certification body such as PJR to conduct your audits. You'll need a stage 1 and a stage 2 audit for initial certifications, not for transitions from version 4.0 to 4.1. You'll address any identified nonconformities before a certificate can be issued, and certificates are good for 3 years. Stage 1 audit is primarily a documentation review to confirm readiness for Stage 2, whereas the Stage 2 is a full system audit, sampling all of the processes, all of the shifts, to really get a sense of how effectively the standard requirements are being met and the system has been implemented. Again, any nonconformities identified do need to be resolved before a certificate can be issued. I mentioned that certificates are good for 3 years. Following the initial certification, you'd be in the surveillance audit cycle, portion of the cycle, 2 years worth of surveillance audits following that stage 2. We have semi-annual and annual contracts depending on a number of factors, including a client organization's preference. And those constitute partial system audits not as long as a stage 2. However, the 3rd year in the cycle would represent the recertification audit, another full system audit, very similar to the stage 2 in nature. Close out any nonconformities that might have been issued before another certificate can be issued to start the cycle anew. So that's a high-level summary of the certification process. and the key changes between version 4.0 and 4.1. If you have any questions, please feel free to type them into the chat field now, and I'll put my contact information up here on the last slide. Again, my name is Austin. I'm the EHS Program Manager. Feel free to reach out to me via email or through the main PJR line. They can put you through to my extension if you have any technical standard questions. e-Stewards is also a great resource as the standard holder. And if you are a new client looking for a quote for e-Stewards certification, you can reach our sales department through the number on the screen. Okay, so far I don't see any questions. I'll hang out for another moment or two, but thank you for joining me today. If you have your transition audit coming up, I hope the content of this webinar is helpful. And as we continue to do version 4.1 audits, if we learn anything new, I'll certainly keep the slides up to date. So feel free to tune back into a future airing of this webinar or on this subject matter to see if the content has changed at all. In lieu of questions, I'm going to go ahead and sign off. Again, a recording of today's webinar will be posted on PJR's website. And should you have any technical questions, you can reach me via email or phone. Thanks so much for your time today and have a great day.